So another little discussion in our We Ran Out of Time lecture series, and this one is about the end of the Cold War. So what we're going to focus on, other than our Cold War lecture that I did about a week ago, we got us all the way up to 1970 and Brezhnev, right? And so we're going to pick up there, and we're mostly going to talk about the end of the Soviet Union, and then we're going to move on a little bit and talk about what's going on in the Soviet Union now, okay? So the end of the Cold War. So disarmament, beginning in the late 60s, and this is going to overlap a little bit for what we talked about last time. In the late 60s, the U.S. and the USSR had created enough nuclear weapons to destroy the world numerous times, and they kind of looked up and said, that's crazy. And so we were living, and as I mentioned in the other lecture, by a philosophy known as mutually assured destruction, or appropriately abbreviated as MAD. Right? And it simply means that, I'm going to shoot my missiles at you, and you're going to see them coming before they hit you, so you're going to shoot your missiles at me, and we blow each other up. Mutually assured destruction, right? And so by the 1970s, the two countries had come together. Well, in the late 60s under Nixon, there was SALT I. In the 1970s, they really got serious about bringing down the numbers of nuclear weapons, disarming, under the Carter administration. So in 1970, President Carter, in the 1970s, he was elected in 76, President Carter begins the strategic limitation talks, or the SALT talks with the USSR, right? So they meet, they discuss de-armament, right, and bringing down the numbers of nuclear weapons until 1979. And in 1979, Afghanistan, or Russia, the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan. This would be a big mistake for the Soviet Union. And we talked about this in our Modern Nationalism, how Afghanistan had a communist-friendly leader. That communist-friendly leader was overthrown by Muslim forces. The Soviets tried to drive in and put that communist leader back in power, like they did in Czechoslovakia, like they did in Hungary. Didn't work out so well then. The Americans come in, secretly supply the Mujahideen, and eventually, after many years of warfare, the Soviets lose. They're Vietnam, right? But in 79, the Russians go in. Carter is angry. The talks break down. He boycotts the Olympics, which is not a good idea. But, what's he going to do? It's in Moscow, right? And so 1980, Ronald Reagan is elected president and calls the USSR the evil empire and begins the largest peacetime buildup of weapons in the history of the Cold War. And so the SALT talks, when Reagan is elected, the SALT talks are done, right? You can't negotiate with someone that you call the evil empire, yes? Okay. So here is Carter and Brezhnev. The thing about the Russian leaders during this period of time is they just kept getting older and older. They had Brezhnev, they had a drop-off, and these guys would be given a speech and lose their place and have to find it again, and it would take an hour. And it was, the leaders matched the health of the Soviet Union. The health of the leaders of the Soviet Union matched the health of the Soviet Union, which is bad, right? And so here we have Carter and Brezhnev talking in the disarmament and the SALT peace treaty, right? Okay, so the Soviet crackdown of Eastern Europe. It was during this period of time, we'll back up a little bit, right, that some Eastern Bloc countries felt that old tickle of nationalism and wanted to get out there, and even if they were still communists, they just wanted to be their own communists and not connect to the Soviet Union. Well, the Soviets shut that down under Brezhnev, right? So in 1956, we have the Hungarian uprising. The Soviets brutally put down nationalist rebellion in Hungary. The leaders were executed, and a puppet government was put in place. And this was in Budapest, right, the city, the capital of Hungary. Remind me in class, and I'll tell you a really interesting story that I heard from a Hungarian student one time about that uprising, right? 1968 was Prague Spring, and if you are familiar with Arab Spring, it was named after Prague Spring, right? Czechoslovakia, communist leader Alexander Dubek, and this is a communist country who's just trying to get out from under the umbrella of the Soviets and have their own form of communism. Again, same result. Soviet takes roll in. The movement is crushed, and the Soviets take back that area. Now, what we have in the 50s, though, we don't have global news and global media like we do today. And so behind that iron curtain, as Churchill would name it, the Soviets can pretty much do anything they want, and media and information doesn't really get out. And so they can be as cruel, and they can shut things down as much as they want, and the rest of the world is going to know some but not all of the story. That's different from today, right? And so the Brezhnev Doctrine. The USSR reserves the right to invade any socialist country that was deemed to be threatened by internal elements hostile to socialism. So America has the domino philosophy. It has the Truman Doctrine. They have the Brezhnev Doctrine. It means don't get out of line or we're going to kill you. Okay, so here we have an example. And I think this is Prague Spring, right? Tanks rolling down the main street there. This guy is trying to get to work, man. Just trying to get to work, right? And so just an example of the Soviets cracking down on their eastern countries there, their allies, right? Okay. So Reagan and Gorbachev. As we said, Reagan was a guy who did not feel like negotiating with the Soviets or disarming any nuclear weapons. He actually built them up. And the nuclear weapons would reach the height in the 80s, as many nuclear weapons as we ever had in the world. I saw one stat one time that said we were able to destroy the world like 20 times over. And again, why would you want to destroy the world 20 times? You don't have to do it once, right? But anyway, so Reagan begins the largest peacetime buildup of nuclear arms in history, and he introduces a program known as Star Wars. Not the movie, people. It's an actual program of Star Wars, a missile defense system. We'll talk about that in a second. So the Soviet Union, of course, sees this and goes, holy crap, we've got to do something about this. So they began to put all their resources toward arming themselves, building more nuclear weapons, finding ways to deliver those nukes through submarines, through bombers, and things like that, right? But here's the problem. And this is the problem with communism in industrial Soviet Union. When you don't have competition, then technology does not grow, okay? And so at the end of the Soviet Union, the United States was 50 years ahead of the Soviet Union in computers and technology and how to do things that way, right? Whereas the Soviets still had computers that took up an entire room. We had personal computers, PCs, right? And again, the idea of capitalism and competition really gave America a boost, right? And put them way ahead of the Soviet Union because we had businesses competing with each other to create the smaller chips that could fit into the computers. And they did. They had like large government-owned businesses that did not try to make things better because they didn't think they had to, right? There was no incentive there. And that's a bigger discussion, the idea that if you're a Soviet worker and you're never going to be promoted, then why should you try? You know, and to the Americans, it's like, yeah, if I'm always going to be like flipping burgers the rest of my life, why would I want to be the best burger flipper? I just want to be adequate. And, you know, and that's the capitalist mindset for that. But that's really what killed the Soviet Union, the idea that there is no progression, there is no technological advance. It's simply just trying to keep up with America, and America is sprinting into the future in internet and technology and computers and things like that, right? And so Gorbachev, so they ran themselves into the ground trying to keep up with Reagan. And trying to keep up with Star Wars and trying to keep up, and then they had no money for other things like food, right? So finally, Gorbachev is elected premier of Russia after all the old guys die, and then Russia is elected. Russia elects Gorbachev. Gorbachev comes in and looks at the situation and says, we cannot keep this up, right? We don't have the money, we don't have the technology in order to keep this up. And so he throws a cold bucket of reality onto the Soviet Union and says we're going to loosen our hold on the client states, Eastern Europe. We're going to introduce a couple of programs that are going to help Russia come into the 21st century, and that might not include communism. Okay? So here is a diagram of the Star Wars project. Okay, so the red things there are missiles and submarines. Those are the baddies. And the baddies are shooting missiles up in the air against the satellites, and satellites detect them. Ooh, the baddies are coming. And so this gives America time to shoot intercepting missiles up into the air and blow up the baddies as they come over into our airspace. Therefore, we are safe. Now, if we choose to, we can shoot missiles back at them. They don't have a Star Wars program. They can't stop us. So it's actually kind of a protective net over the United States, keeping the United States from being hit by nuclear missiles when we can shoot everybody else. Here's the secret. This is never going to happen because we didn't have the technology in the 80s to make stuff like this, right? It would have cost billions and billions of dollars. It would have bankrupted us. And so it wasn't going to happen. It was, you know, the scientists were like, okay, this is fun. I can also, like, you know, make food appear out of midair and eat a hoagie. Yeah, no, you can't do that either, right? But the Russians didn't know that. And so the Russians believe we were right on the cusp of creating the Star Wars program, and they ran themselves into the ground. And so you can look at Reagan in one or two ways, that he was like, you know, a little kid saying, oh, let's make a Star Wars thing. Or he was saying, hey, let's make a Star Wars thing. Let's say we're making a Star Wars thing, and the Russians will bankrupt themselves trying to keep up with us. Yeah, you choose your Reagan. Okay, now, here we have a satire cartoon dealing with that, right? And so we've got Reagan here, and we've got C-3PO and R2-D2 and E.T. You know who these people are, shut up. and we've assembled a crack team of experts to advise us on these projects of Star Wars. So again, the idea that scientists are like, I don't think we can do this, Mr. Reagan. He's like, shh, don't tell anybody. Yeah? Okay, so focusing on the Soviet Union now. So the Soviet Union is the one in trouble. We're going to spend the rest of the time talking about it. And so what did Gorbachev do? What were his reforms? Loosening of Soviet bloc countries. Well, this was kind of a no-brainer. The Soviet Union didn't have the power at the time to keep these countries in check, like Hungary and Poland and Estonia, Latvia, and all those Eastern Bloc countries. They didn't have the power or the manpower or anything like that. So, I mean, to make a comparison with the Romans, they pull out of Britain to protect Rome. Well, the Soviet army pulls out of these countries to go back and settle problems in the Soviet Union, right? So Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania, large numbers of East Germans begin to move west. When those limits and those barriers are lifted, a lot of Eastern Europeans will move to the west, move to the more capitalist side, Perestroika, that's a cool word. Perestroika simply means restructuring. And so what we're doing is we're freeing up businesses to be more private, right? We're not it's not all government-controlled businesses anymore where you have to I think our fearless leader, the head of the department, Mr. Wagshaw, lived in Russia during this period of time, and he said you always wanted to get shoes at the beginning of the month and not at the end of the month. Because if you got shoes at the end of the month, they were just trying to make a quota, so they'd sew them out really fast, and you put them on and they fall apart. At the beginning of the month, they would do it really slow and do a good job. But again, they're just trying to meet a quota. And so this was the Soviet Union. But if you introduce Nike into the Soviet Union, all of a sudden you have a variety. You have a choice, right? And that's what began to happen. It wasn't just they let Russian businesses be private. They invited international businesses into the Soviet Union to begin restaurants and shopping and things like that to give the Russians more variety and to help their economy, to stimulate their economy, right? Glasnost means openness. And here's the thing that teachers never do. I'm never going to walk into a class and say, hey, could you tell me what's wrong with our school? Because this would take all day and you just end up yelling at me. This is what Gorbachev did. Gorbachev, with Glasnost, says, okay, you are allowed to criticize the government if you want to criticize the government. Again, there was no freedom of speech in the Soviet Union during the communist period, right? If you spoke out against the Soviet Union, you were thrown in jail, you were sent to Siberia, whatever. Gorbachev's, that's over with. Freedom of the press, freedom of speech, let's do it. And boy, he got shellacked. The people were just angry with the government and angry with all of the mess and building up of arms and things like that. And there was a lot of public opinion out there against the Soviet Union. In Russia, right? All right, come on. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to show you this in class. But what this is a Pizza Hut commercial, and it's the first Pizza Hut commercial ever run in Russia. Pizza Hut was one of the first restaurants to get permission to go to the Soviet Union and open up franchises in Moscow and other cities. And so in the commercial, we have this family sitting around talking about all the changes and everything going on. And it's like, well, Gorbachev says it's all right. And they turn to the corner, and there's Gorbachev's eating with this little girl, right? And they're both eating pizza. Gorbachev says it's okay, right? And so this was a Russian Pizza Hut commercial advertising Pizza Hut. Okay, so the times they are changing, right? Okay. So the fall of the Berlin Wall is a major event that marks the fall of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union cannot put up a strong face anymore and say we're fine. Well, this happened in November 9th, 1989. I remember, right? We'll watch videos on this in class. This is the fun stuff we're going to do after the AP exam. It'll be fun, right? And so the wall comes down. We see these East German soldiers. They kind of look like, oh, well, and they're knocking this thing down. And all these Westerners over here in their fancy clothes and all their capitalist stuff are saying, yay, come over to the West. Now, I was actually in Berlin in the early 90s, and right after the wall fell, and you'd be in West Berlin, and they had zoos and shopping malls and crazy capitalist things. You go over to the East, and it was concrete, and that was about it. It was very gray, there was lots of concrete, and there was nothing there. We had a tour guide, and the tour guide told us that when the wall fell, a lot of East Germans were driving over to the West in their communist cars, and they were parking their communist cars and abandoning them and then buying a Western car. And you have all these abandoned cars lined on the roads that they had to haul off because people just don't want to. Now, what this does with Germany, though, it's actually a drag on the German economy. You can imagine that West Germany is flying high in this capitalism. East Germany is sluggish in communism, and now it's one Germany again, and the West has to pull the East along for a number of years before they get strong enough to be equal with the West. And so there was a drag on the German economy. Of course, as we know now, the German economy is the strongest in continental Europe, right? And so they do recover. Okay, so the overthrow of Gorbachev. So Gorbachev made a lot of changes, and it's not always popular, especially with traditionalists, right? So Gorbachev was getting slammed from the left, saying, like, with glasnost and openness, he's getting slammed from the conservatives as well because he's changing too much. And so Perestroika was resisted by the members of the communist system because it took away their power. They're the ones that controlled everything. And again, communism is supposed to be equal, but that never ever happens, which is why communism doesn't work in industrial countries. People are greedy, right? And these greedy people were losing their power to Pizza Hut. And they're like, why are you doing this? And then Glasnost, of course, was a brutal barrage from people saying, your government is oppressive, and we need to start religion again, and we need to open shopping malls and all this stuff, right? And so finally, there was a coup against Gorbachev. A very kind of, if you remember back, right, to the end of the Romanovs, the end of the dynastic period in Russia, when there was one last ditch effort of the army to come into the capital and take over in a military coup and reestablish everything, and that fell apart. This same thing happens. This military general tries to come into the capital and take over the government and put everything back to communism. He is suppressed, but Gorbachev goes into hiding. Gorbachev resigns, and he's replaced by Boris Yeltsin, who crushes the coup and becomes the new president of Russia, Boris Yeltsin, right? And so Russia leaves communism behind completely and moves on to the new day of being Russia as it is today. December 25th, 1991, the Soviet flag flies over the Kremlin for the last time, all right? And so Russia is now Russia and no longer the Soviet Union. Here we are, Yeltsin on the left, Gorbachev on the right. He always had this weird birthmark on top of his head. And I saw an SNL skit where, like, he would lie and then the birthmark would get bigger. It was funny. But anyway, it didn't shape like anything. It was just a birthmark, right? But Yeltsin is going to be in power for a few years, yes? And eventually he would come out of power and be replaced by Putin. Now, Putin has been, in charge in Russia for a very long time. There were laws saying you can only have so many terms in office, and so he would stop being president. He'd put a puppet in as president, and then he would be president again, right? He would be prime minister, and then he would be president again. Of course, he's president today. And I'm going to be honest with you. He runs that country like a mafia boss. He's former KGB. He gets kickbacks. He's probably one of the wealthiest men in the world, but he hides all his money in different places. People who criticize him die. I mean, it's very much of a Godfather type scenario. And so, when we talk about America being friendly with Russia, we need to table that. We need to think close about that, because that's like us being friendly with, like, a serial killer or something like that. We need to really think about that. And when you see people defending Putin, you need to say, read up a little bit and figure out what you're talking about, because he's essentially a mafia boss in charge of a country, is what he is. But anyway, there's Russia. There's where we are today. They're dealing in elections and stuff like that, and there's lots of corruption going on in Russia, but they're trying, right? So anyway, there's the end of the Cold War. Enjoy.